Most of the countries that we have been dealing with so far in this series had a political system that political scientists refer to as a competitive oligarchy. The people in charge of the government were primarily upper-class white men who belonged to one of the country's major elite parties. We do not consider most of these regimes to be fully democratic because most of the population was still excluded from the political system. But these regimes were constitutional republics that held regular elections and divided power across multiple institutions and political actors. But during the 1930s, this type of oligarchic political system comes to an end throughout most of Latin America. This graph shows a classification of Latin American regime types by the political scientist Peter Smith. And we see that most of Latin America's competitive oligarchies abruptly die off during the early 1930s, giving way to a more repressive and more overtly authoritarian type of regime, either a military dictatorship or a personal dictatorship. Latin American militaries play a central role in the death of many of the region's competitive oligarchies. These militaries underwent a professionalization process during the late 19th century, but they still have political goals of their own. During the 20s and 30s, many junior officers in particular come to the conclusion that their country's traditional political elite is no longer capable of running the country, and they are increasingly willing to push unpopular leaders out of office. Military coups become a common occurrence across Latin America by the 1930s. 15 of the 20 countries in the region experienced at least one military coup during the 30s. However, the coups during this period do not usually lead to long-lasting military dictatorships. Instead, most of the military regimes that come to power during the 30s step down and return to the barracks within a year, and they hand power to somebody else. Occasionally a democratically elected government, but in most cases a strongman or personal dictator. The main difference between a personal dictatorship and the partisan dictatorships that we saw earlier in this series is that under a personal dictatorship, power is concentrated in a single person who is relatively unconstrained by other institutions of government or by their own political party. A classic example of a personal dictator that we already met in this series is the Mexican ruler Porfirio Díaz. By the early 1930s, most of Latin America is governed by some sort of personal dictator. One important factor that is driving the rise of personal dictatorships in the Caribbean basin is a shift in the United States foreign policy in the region. Since the 1890s, the United States has intervened in nearly every country in Central America and the Caribbean. These interventions initially took the form of gunboat diplomacy and surgical coups, but by the 1910s, they had transformed into long-term occupations of Latin American countries by the U.S. military that were intended to prop up pro-U.S. governments and defeat rebel groups that were likely to be less friendly to American business interests if they came to power. However, during the 1930s, the United States government is facing the financial strain of the Great Depression, and it is now seeking to end these expensive occupations and extricate itself from the region. In the place of direct military occupation, the U.S. government is coming to rely on local strongmen who will govern their countries in the interests of American business. Many of these men were the products of elite political parties in their countries, but by the 30s, they have either sidelined or co-opted their country's traditional parties, and they no longer face the same partisan or constitutional constraints that leaders in competitive oligarchies and partisan dictatorships normally face. As a result, many of these dictators survive in office for well over a decade. But this shift in US foreign policy is hardly the only reason behind the rise of personal dictatorships in Latin America. Prior to World War II, the United States intervened mostly in Central America and the Caribbean. Yet we also see a very similar type of authoritarian regime take power in the 1930s in parts of South America that are still mostly beyond the reach of the American empire during the interwar period. For the remainder of this video, I am going to examine the rise and consolidation of personal dictatorships in 3 of the countries that have been the focus of our last several videos: Chile, Brazil, and Uruguay. We shall begin with Chile. As we have seen before, early 20th century Chile had that pseudo-parliamentary system of government that retained the presidency but transferred much of the executive power to a cabinet that would be responsible to the Congress. This system was great at distributing patronage across all of the major elite parties, but it was infamously bad at getting even the most popular pieces of legislation passed through the notoriously gridlocked Chilean Congress. In 1920, a populist liberal politician named Arturo Alessandri is elected president on a platform of sweeping political reform that would reorganize Chile's political system and make it more responsive to popular interests. However, Alessandri faces bitter opposition from the Congress, including from many members of his own Liberal Party. Alessandri's reform agenda quickly stalls, and this only adds to the public's frustration over the dysfunctional nature of Chile's parliamentary republic. Then in 1924, near the end of Alessandri's term, there is an incident in the Chilean Senate. A group of junior military officers pack the Senate galleries. They refuse to leave when asked, and they begin rattling the sabers that are part of their dress uniforms, disrupting the Senate session. This was probably not intended to be a military coup. Instead, it appears that these junior officers were only trying to bully the Congress into passing some of Alessandri's reform proposals. However, Chile's civilian politicians are so freaked out by this incident that they attempt to placate the military by appointing a senior army general as the equivalent of the prime minister in Chile's pseudo-parliamentary system. This new government succeeds at browbeating the Congress into passing much of Alessandri's reform program, but Alessandri himself gets so nervous about the military's influence in the government that he flees the country a few days later. In the absence of the president, this military-led civilian government transforms into an outright military junta. However, those junior military officers who had packed the Senate galleries back in September decide that this military junta is not nearly reformist enough. And in early 1925, a group of officers led by the cavalry officer Carlos Ibáñez and the Air Force officer Marmaduke Grobe stage a new military coup that establishes a second junta. Among other things, this junta calls for a constituent assembly to draft a new constitution. It also convinces Alessandri to come back from exile to serve out the remainder of his term as president. Alessandri returns in March 1925, the new constitution is promulgated in September, and a more or less democratic election is held in October that elects a new president named Emiliano Figueroa. So it seems like this should be the end of it, and Chile's political system will now stabilize back into a civilian constitutional government. However, the Chilean military is not quite done intervening in Chilean politics. The military pressures Figueroa to appoint the leader of the 1925 coup, Carlos Ibáñez, to serve as his Minister of War. Ibáñez gradually accumulates more and more power in this administration, and in 1927, he convinces President Figueroa that it is in his best interest to step aside and let Ibáñez govern outright. Carlos Ibáñez is elected president in 1927 in an uncontested election in which he is the only candidate on the ballot. The Radical Party actually endorses him, while the Liberal and Conservative parties decide not to run their own candidates because they know that Ibáñez is probably going to seize power anyway. Ibáñez then establishes a personal dictatorship that nevertheless relies on the support of the traditional parties and includes members of the old political class in the cabinet. We shall now turn to Brazil, which was still ruled by those state-level Republican political machines that we covered in the last video. Brazil's oligarchy faces a number of challenges during the 1920s, including 3 major military mutinies led by a group of disgruntled junior army officers known as the Tenente or Lieutenants Movement. But the state political machine survived these crises, and they managed to hold on to power until the 1930 presidential election. This election is won by the Sao Paulo politician Julio Prestes by around a 20 percentage point margin, but the losing candidate from the rival political machine of Rio Grande do Sul, Getúlio Vargas, refuses to concede defeat, and he launches a revolution against the outgoing president in an effort to overturn the election result. Vargas is joined not only by the state militias loyal to the political machines that had supported his candidacy, but also by the Lieutenants Movement, which uses this opportunity to overthrow several of the state governments in northern Brazil. Meanwhile, in Rio de Janeiro, the military high command attempts to end this civil war by staging its own military coup that overthrows the outgoing president, Washington Luiz. The military leadership attempts to establish a military junta, but it is unable to consolidate its control over a country that is in the middle of a civil war. After only a few days in power, the military steps down and it hands power to the rebel leader, Getúlio Vargas, who is sworn in as president. So in the end, this coup has the effect of annulling the result of the 1930 election and elevating to power the man who had lost this election by a wide margin. Vargas consolidates his power over the following years, and he establishes one of the longest-lasting personal dictatorships in South America during this era. He governs Brazil all the way until 1945, when he is finally overthrown in another military coup. Finally, we are going to return to Uruguay, which had that unusual political system that divided executive power between the president and an executive council known as the Colegiado. This system had worked sort of all right during José Baez's lifetime, but it begins to fall apart shortly after his death in 1929. In the early 1930s, both executive bodies are controlled by the Baezista party, but this party has become deeply ideologically fractured since Baez's death. And it is divided between socialists who want to push Baezismo further to the left, center-left progressives who see themselves as the defenders of Baez's original political vision, and center-right establishment politicians who hope to steer Baezismo back toward the right. Although this party controls both national executives, the presidency is controlled by the right-wing Baezistas, while the more progressive Baezistas are the dominant force on the Colegiado. As a result, the rivalry between these factions quickly spills over into the institutions of government themselves. And the Colegiado and the right-wing Bajista president Gabriel Terra enter into a standoff that escalates into a full-blown constitutional crisis by 1933. Around this same time, Uruguay's other traditional party, the National Party, has broken apart along ideological lines. And the more left-wing Blanco sector has formed an alliance with the progressive Bajistas, giving them a majority in both the Congress and the Colegiado. Meanwhile, the right-wing Blanco leader Luis Alberto de Herrera has turned against the democracy that he had helped establish a generation earlier, and he has threatened to lead a march on Montevideo. In making this threat, Herrera was probably trying to evoke the Blanco revolutionary tradition of rebelling against Colorado governments. But in a country that has a huge Italian immigrant population, many in Montevideo interpreted this as an allusion to Mussolini's march on Rome. In either case, Herrera was pretty unambiguously threatening to overthrow Uruguay's democratically elected government through force. In the end, however, Herrera's revolution or coup turned out not to be necessary, because the right-wing Colorado president Gabriel Terra convinces him that they should instead join forces against their common enemy, the left wings of their own political parties. The Blanco leader Herrera calls off this insurrection, and the Colorado president Terra uses the powers of the presidency to stage a self-coup that forcibly dissolves both the Colegiado and the Congress. During the course of this coup, the leaders of the progressive Bajista and Blanco factions are arrested, and they are sent to a political prison on a tiny island off the coast of Uruguay. Terra then forms an unusual bipartisan dictatorship that includes the most conservative sectors from both the Colorado and national parties in the governing coalition. The dictatorships of Chile, Brazil, and Uruguay in the 1930s are three very different authoritarian regimes, but they rise to power for similar reasons. A common thread in all of these cases is the breakdown of the earlier oligarchic political institutions. Prominent members of the traditional political establishment either lose faith in their country's institutions or they decide to stop playing by the constitutional rules of the game. And this contributes directly to the political crisis that enabled the authoritarian regimes to seize power. The military played a prominent role in overthrowing the oligarchic political systems in Chile and Brazil, but none of these cases are a straightforward story of the military displacing the oligarchy from power. Instead, the oligarchy played a prominent role in all of these regimes. Getúlio Vargas in Brazil and Gabriel Terra in Uruguay were both products of the traditional political establishment in their countries. The Chilean dictator Carlos Ibáñez was more of a political outsider, but even his dictatorship included civilians from Chile's traditional political establishment in its governing coalition. Despite this continuity in personnel and elite support, these dictatorships were a great deal more repressive than the oligarchic political systems that had preceded them. All of these dictatorships directed much of their repression against the communist left in their respective countries. The Uruguayan dictatorship also repressed the left wings of the Bajista and national parties. One of the most prominent victims of Terra's dictatorship was the socialist Bajista leader Julio César Grauert, who was shot by the police while leaving a pro-democracy rally, and he died in the government's custody a few days later after being denied medical treatment. However, these dictatorships did not rely solely on repression. All of them made a conscious effort to build a popular following for their regimes by courting the support of organized labor and by implementing populist economic policies. Only the Brazilian dictator Getúlio Vargas succeeded at mobilizing a mass base that continued to support him even after his fall from power. But in all three of these cases, these attempts to attract mass support reflected a recognition that the age of oligarchic politics was truly over by the 1930s. From now on, not even an authoritarian regime can hope to remain in power for more than a few years without the support of a significant segment of the mass population.